right, welcome to our afternoon panel at San Diego Comic-Con. We're going to be talking about graphic novels inspired by real life, the true stories behind graphic novels. And we're going to be talking with the best-selling authors Nate Powell, Jensen, and Scott Chantler, as well as Diana Pho, who is a former editor with Tor Publishing. I'm going to introduce Jensen first. Van's comics career started in 2009 following a career as a crime reporter at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette in Little Rock, Arkansas. His comic series include Pinocchio, Vampire Slayer, Cryptocracy, and Valkyrie Beer Delivery. In 2019, he released with Gallery 13 the graphic novel Two Dead, which is illustrated with Nate Powell. By Nate Powell. This is an action-packed pulpy noir set in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1946, when the city simmered with racial tension and mob violence. The story centers on Chief of Detectives Abraham Bailey and war hero Gideon Kemp, who is hired by the city's mayor to keep an eye on this veteran officer, who we're going to hear about in a moment. Nate Powell needs little introduction. He is a National Book Award winning illustrator for his work on the March trilogy, written with Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Aden. His multiple other honors include Eisner Awards, a Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, Ignatz Award, the Michael L. Prince Award, a Coretta Scott King Award, and 4 Yalsa Great Graphic Novels for Teens Award. His other graphic novels include Come Again, About Face, Two Dead, which we're going to be talking about today, and many more. Scott Chantler is an Eisner, Harvey, hey Scott.
Hello.
Eisner, Harvey, and Doug Wright Award nominee, and he's the creator of the family memoir Two Generals and the epic frontier adventure Northwest Passage. His new graphic biography is titled Bix, and it's the story of the famed jazz icon Leon Bix Beiderbecke. And in that story, he's using a very unconventional cartooning style that seeks to visualize, in Scott's own words, musical rhythms in a meaningful way. This book is, according to my reviewer, one that you at once see, hear, and believe. So we're excited to look at that. Diana Pho is a 3-time Hugo Award nominated editor of fantasy, horror, and LGBTQ literary, middle grade science fiction, and a whole slew of other types of titles. She is now going to be starting a full-time position at Serial Box as a producer, specializing in storytelling. She's worked in comics and is now starting to, we're going to hear about her background in comics and sci-fi and what she's going to be doing going forward. So I'd like to just jump right in here to a question for all of you, and this has to do with your stories, Two Dead and the Bix biography. So the question I have is, what drew you to tell these deeply personal stories? For you, Scott, in Bix, you write at the end about literally this project kind of saving your life. You were going through a series of kind of tragedies, one after the other, and you wanted to do something that would help and bring you healing. And also, can you talk a little bit about this idea of working in the music, musicality and rhythms of putting that on the page in the graphic format?
Sure. Yeah, this project thankfully existed long before this string of personal tragedies happened. So, it was great that I had it to kind of work on. It was a bit of a dream project that I'd been thinking about for many years. So it was nice to have that to sink my teeth into as something of a distraction during some pretty rough times. But really, the genesis of the book had occurred really about a decade ago when I started thinking about how to kind of capture music visually in comics. I think I'd read an interview with somebody, I can't even remember who now, talking about how music is the one thing that comics really can't do. And I kind of bristled at that a little bit because I think comics can kind of do anything. And obviously comics can't, you can't literally hear the music while you're reading comics, but you can sort of feel it. I have always thought of my stories in a very rhythmic way. Pacing is very important to me. And so I've always wanted to do a project that would try to visualize music in a more sophisticated way than just notes coming out of the end of the horn. So I've always kind of had that in the back of my head. And I settled on Bix as a subject much later. It was going to be a matter of finding a musician whose life, spoke to me in a particular way. And that was going to be who I hung this formal experiment on. But, once I kind of latched on to Bix, he seemed like the guy. So, although it's a character that I really kind of relate to, the origin of the book, like I say, was very formal.
Yeah, we don't have slides for this panel, but I think it's really important to visually show what the book is doing.
Yep. I have a copy of the book right here. I was going to do this if you didn't.
Okay, great. Yeah, and maybe you have a page picked out, but I just wanted to show the kind of, you do have a page, Scott?
I got a few things, just like
great.
Most of the book is laid out in a kind of a horizontal strip format like this. Sorry, I'm just making sure that that I'm lining up with the camera, kind of a strict kind of 5-panel strip per page, 10 panels when the book is open. And that's when life is kind of normal, everyday life back at home kind of stuff. When he starts playing music as a child, sorry, I don't have that page bookmarked, but I can find one. The panels start to bounce up and down like musical notes. Mm-hmm. And then when he discovers jazz,
it's literally like mirroring.
Playing jazz, the panels start to get a little more free and kind of overlapping and bouncing around and bleeding off the page and stuff until, and as his music gets more sophisticated and his life gets more complicated, the page layouts reflect that change. And then as his downfall at the end, we go back into that, tight, constraining 5-panel per page beat. So that's, for people who haven't seen the book, that's kind of roughly how it works.
Yeah. And that's really mirroring the kind of jazz improv of jazz, the music itself, and also the emotions and events of Bix's life, because we'll get into it in a little bit, but the substance abuse and his alcoholism, those are all of those kinds of emotions are reflected in visually on the page through the panel placement. It's really interesting.
That's exactly right. It was always meant to play kind of both ways like that.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
I have a similar question for you, Van and Nate. This is a twofold question. For both of you, Two Dead is pretty close to home. Nate, you were born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas, and Van, you spent a considerable amount of time there working as a crime reporter, so you both know the region well, and it comes across in this book. So I'd like to, ask you about that. This book is inspired by true events, but it is historical fiction. And you write in your acknowledgments at the end that it's really meant to spur urgent conversations about important truths. And we're going to get into like what those are a little bit later, but can you talk about, in general, what your aim was with doing this book and how it kind of was conceived? And was it serendipity that just happened to, your hometown, Nate, or did you guys work on think of this project together for a long time before it became something tangible? I'll hand it over to you. Who wants to start?
so it was just the kind of thing where, I mean, as a crime reporter, you know, you're always looking for just things of interest. I mean, it's there's the grind of the job, but then there's bigger things that you see. And so it was really just this true story of Little Rock's history that was incredibly tragic, but also, you know, it spoke to things that are very current. It spoke to racial inequality, and it spoke to just problems with policing, and like what happens when police act inappropriately. And so, as you know, as I just became fixated on this historic story, I was very intent on finding a way to, you know, I wrote about it in the newspaper, but I also just knew that it could be this bigger story. And so Nate and I kind of have this weird long history of being connected and of knowing each other. But I think it was at Comic-Con actually in maybe like 2010, 2011, that, you know, we were just talking, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm working on this story, trying to make this comic about something that's set in Little Rock. And of course, you know, I very much knew that Nate was born and raised in North Little Rock. And when I talked to him about that, but then also the fact that the story incorporates mental health, you know, Nate was very, thankfully for me, Nate was just like, yes, I want to draw this book. And I mean, you know, I am always going to be thrilled to work with Nate anytime that possibility comes up.
Oh, go ahead, Nate. Did you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, really, this project had a lot of false starts and a lot of early work for several years on and off. And I think it's, in a lot of ways, it's fortuitous that I think I was able to grow into being able to tackle the story and the subject matter in a more complete way. It also started out as a serialized comic that was going to be like a floppy 10-issue series. So even in a creative and structural way, we were bouncing back and forth between working in an increasingly genre-based noir detective action-oriented format, and then basically once the serialized format fizzled and we were looking for a home as a graphic novel, we kind of realized that the potential was wide open to repace the book, to refocus it, and to really reconsider what we had worked on for years. And in that time, Van and I both became parents. Our relationships with you know, with our families, with our kids, and with our communities also changed. And yeah, I mean, it was a decade's worth of collaboration on and off. But what's interesting is that we both had these parallels in life, which I think allowed us to approach the story in ways that were sympathetic to the characters, but also sympathetic to where each other was in life and what we wanted to get out of the book.
Yeah, it went from being, I look back and cringe at basically everything that I've worked on in the past, but the earliest iterations of it are just this. It was a very straightforward noir action book that had, you know, kind of interesting themes, and then, you know, as we were working on it, was also concurrent with the appearance of the Black Lives Matter movement. Like that, when we started working on the book, that didn't exist, and then it came to the forefront of culture and politics. And so as we were working on this book that is about police brutality and racial inequality, even though it was set in the 1940s, we realized how much the onus was on us to really give it justice, to take it very seriously, to not, you know, fall back on easy genre tropes, but to really grapple with all of the thorny stuff that this entails. I think we might have we might have a frozen moderator.
Yeah, she's frozen for me. Yeah.
Just deep in reflection.
It was such a good answer.
It really was too.
I mean, we got the answer. I just don't know. I think she's gonna have to hop off for a minute, so I'm gonna pause the recording.
the Black Lives Matter movement, and how you really didn't have that in mind when you were writing this book, but then it became actually perfectly timed to its release almost, and now even more so. So did we want to keep talking about that, or did you want to move on to I wanted to ask Diana about her work with acquiring works of realism, in graphic novels, but I don't want to cut you off.
I would say, in the interest of time, go ahead and jump on to Diana.
Okay. All right. So Diana, in your work with graphic novels, how did what you've acquired in the past, decade, how have they fit into this topic of real life and the true stories behind our lives? I mean, you worked in fantasy and sci-fi. What's your experience with these kinds of stories that we're talking about today?
When I read through both books, Bix and Two Dead are quite, incredible. And where I come from, I usually just talk about genre stuff all the time. It's all about dragons and spaceships and destroying empire, all the good stuff, right? And what I really enjoyed about these stories is that, and I think it's really unique specifically for the comics medium compared to prose novels, which I also edit, is the fact that in comics, you can be, more self-reflective, but also make creative choices that would really highlight or emphasize real life elements in the same way that you would do in a fantasy or a science fiction book, whether it's how you shape your characters, how you show the characters and the panels on the page. Like earlier when Scott was showing, the layout of Bix, to some extent, it's realist, but it's also fantastic because it's taking this perspective of his life and just blowing up about how much music had, created this other world, specifically for Bix. And for Two Dead and the use of noir, as soon as a ghost popped up, I'm like, oh, I like this now. There's a ghost.
Yeah.
But again, it shows all these dark psychological elements, and is able to discuss them in a way that both feels relatable, because these are everyday experiences. People go through traumatic things. People have stuff happen in their lives. But because it has this element that seems larger than life, whether it's because it incorporates, something in the characters that you can portray in comics in a fantastical way, or the structure of the story itself, like what Bix did. I think in that sense, comics and genre overlap in very unexpected ways, And I'm always trying to convince people to we all have our inner geek inside. We all nerd out about one thing or another. And so to see realist stories, being told or having elements that, make that crossover much more accessible, it just, I think, helps everyone in the long run understand that storytelling mediums, while we market them as part of certain genres, can have a much wider audience than you expect.
Yeah. Does anybody have Nate or Van, do you have a copy of your Two Dead there? Do you want to show what Diana's referring to when she's talking about how the visual medium kind of communicates these different experiences? I think that maybe a good example is one where with Abraham Bailey, where we first learn that he has this kind of other voice, and I think that's the schizophrenia, that he is hearing this other voice, and it's his partner who he killed, if I have that correct. Are you guys? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've got some
I can't
reference.
see you. There you go.
You bet. Yeah, we can tag team this. You want, Van, or whatever.
I do not have a book in front of me.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. This is show and tell style.
I failed the preparation part of this.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, so basically, yeah, we have someone who's deeply psychologically scarred by a series of violent oversteps early on in his career, who has sort of dug into the path that he has fallen into for 25 years or whatever, who has basically become a living example of corruption, power, and overreach behind a badge, but someone who also becomes basically like a trophy collector for people he has killed in the line of duty, whether in defense or whether proactively. But as a result, not only does he haunt himself, not only does the memory of someone very close to him whose life and death he's responsible for, but even the trophies themselves wind up serving as these implements, not of his conscience, but sort of an embodied splinter that's a foil to his own conscience, that's sort of filling him with a pseudo-religious fervor to justify the psychological splinter. So he winds up, he's very aware on one level that this is not acceptable to society, and that these voices, this sort of splinter world he lives in, is not one that's visible to everyone else. So there's a component of shame and secrecy, but he's also, at the same time, he's sort of in service of this splintered voice that has sort of been carved out of his shattered psyche. So here he has like the gun of someone whose life he has taken, speaking to him, giving him religious, sort of religious commands, filling him with a sense of purpose that continues to like fill up what is now kind of a hollow sense of duty and purpose as a law enforcement officer. He sort of supplanted the general sense of duty and purpose with a completely different one that he's dug into 100%. So we do a lot of play with layout, and with everything is done sort of with a process that mutes everything to have sort of an aging, pulpy tan and brown, but we drop things back out to black and white or to lighter washes to sort of lead us through time, but also lead us through various mental states of several of the main characters.
Yeah, the genius of working with Nate is that, to refer to Nate as the illustrator of the book is a discredit to him, just in that so much storytelling thought and care goes into it. I mean, the way that lettering shifts, and we've had, I appreciate seeing this because it's a testament to Nate's work that we've had people post things online just analyzing the lettering of Two Dead and the way that it shifts moment to moment and character to character to show the psychological states that people are going to, and that and so much more is what Nate brings. And so it's this story of cycles of violence that could be very simple, but it's just so much incredible craft was brought to it that I think it's it's a book that I'm deeply proud of, but I know that it's a million times better than anything that I would have done for everything that Nate brought to it.
Pshaw, but
and touching back on a point that Diana made about how the graphic medium kind of allows this interplay of different genres and different tropes. My question for you, Nate and Jen, Van, is, did you intend to kind of present this kind of subversion of the anti-hero in this book? Because the sheriff is so vicious, and yet he is still this. He is an anti-hero, but he's also, he's kind of the hero as well, in a strange kind of way. But did you think about that, or is that something you intended to play on when you were, or riff on, if you will?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was the thing I think that spoke to me the most about you know, there are a million story ideas out there. Is like when Scott was talking about, you know, he knew he wanted to do something about music, but it's like, how do you settle in on one thing? And there are different things that you look for. And this had so many cool factors, but it particularly, I referred to it from the beginning as pacifist noir. And so, you know, taking that, like, that glory of violence that is written through so much of noir, and really just, you know, reversing it, and sort of holding that violence up to the audience again, and saying, like, is this what you really love? Like, this is what this is like when someone is like, it's my way or the highway, like, I live by a code, I'm just gonna go and, like, enact whatever violence I want to enact. Like, when that actually happens, this is what it looks like. And, you know, evaluate that as you will. And so, you know, I don't know that I hope that there are people who read it maybe not necessarily knowing what they're getting into, and are able to reevaluate their own perspective on violence.
Great. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the mythology behind these stories, because both of them are kind of grounded in a history and also a biography. So Scott, for Bix, you talk a little bit about there being a lot of mythology to sort through with his life and his biography. How did you kind of navigate the factual and the folklore, and how did you decide what to keep in and what to leave out? Or you say at one point he's anything but a reliable narrator, so that gave you some cover in producing this book. But so can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. Yeah, that's always the trick when dealing with historical subject matter. You know, history, you know, I learned a lot 10 years ago when I did my book, Two Generals, about my grandfather's experiences in World War II, about just how difficult it is to do any kind of objective history on a subject. You know, even a subject like that, where I had a lot of, you know, like first person immediate research materials to deal with. You know, you can certainly, you know, any you know, police officer will tell you, you know, you can have two eyewitnesses to the same event who, you know, remember it completely differently. And so yeah, history, I found, like, with that project, I was really wanting to make it his story and not mine. And almost immediately I started hitting my head on the, you know, extent to which that can even be true. You know, even by deciding what's going to be in your book or out of it, you are shaping it. You know, you are creating a narrative that is inarguably yours. So having had that experience, you know, with Bix, I kind of, you know, gave myself a break a little bit more, in that, you know, as I said earlier, this is a book that was mostly a kind of a formal experiment in seeing what comics could do in terms of pushing this idea of musicality. I picked an artist that I had, you know, some kind of personal affinity for. But the reason I picked Bix to begin with is because, you know, of the ways in which his story seemed relatable to me, and presumably would be relatable to other artists. So, you know, I tried to go with the parts of Bix history and Bix kind of legend, if you will, that speak to those ideas, that speak to what was modern about Bix, what is relatable about Bix, you know, what is tragic about Bix, you know, something that, you know, any reader could kind of latch on to. You know, there is a big extent to which it is my story and not his, you know, I happily admit to. But that said, there are, you know, even though, you know, Bix is certainly not the most famous jazz musician to ever lived, but there are some hardcore fans, as there are hardcore fans of anything out there on the internet, who have their opinions about what's true and what's not, and are very invested. They're very invested in that. And, I think I was shielded from that a bit with Two Generals because it was my family history. And to an extent, what I said goes. But with Bix in particular, the Beiderbecke family to this day are very protective of Bix and resent the idea that his parents did not approve. They do not see it that way. And there are a certain kind of group of hardcore, Bix people who are very protective. I will say this: the Bix Beiderbecke Society homepage doesn't say Bix Beiderbecke was an alcoholic. It says that he was such a gentleman that he could not refuse a drink if somebody offered to buy him one. That's the that's what I was up against in terms of how protective some people are of the memory of Bix Beiderbecke. So I did try to step carefully, and as you said, Bix is a kind of an unreliable narrator. He was an alcoholic, and he was a terrific liar, and I don't say that in a bad way necessarily. He was just a character. And so especially as we get deeper into the book and the alcoholism grows and the hallucinations and stuff that are related to that become more of a problem, the more I think it's clear to the reader this is an unreliable narrator. So some of the stuff I've included that might be a little more based in legend than fact. Like I say, I do feel like I have a little bit of cover on it because it all might just be another hallucination.
Yeah, and I think the point about this being kind of a universal story, even though Bix was a somewhat larger than life figure, and his contributions to music are so wonderful. But this is a universal story that anybody can relate to, and I wonder if we're going to see more of these stories in the future, or if we've kind of reached a peak. This question of reaching a peak in comics has been one that we've been asking a little bit in publishing, because we have the format has just exploded over the past decade, and graphic memoir especially has grown. So I'm wondering, if Diana or anybody can jump in on this question. It's, are we going to be seeing more of these realistic stories, more biographies, more slice of life, or where do you think this is headed? And why is the graphic medium so accommodating to these types of stories? And if you want to show more of your books, more pages, I think it's really interesting for the audience to see, the examples in the art. That was a lot to put out there.
I just talked a lot, so I'll let somebody else jump in on this.
Well, I'll say I would guess that, we'll continue to see more of this kind of work. And I think some of it is just in a very broad cultural way. There's a real interest in true stories. And we can hypothesize about what that is. I mean, I think that there's a lot of attack on truth right now. And so maybe it's just like people yearning for something that's actual and that's real and that's concrete. I don't know for sure. But even so, I do work in film and TV too, and it's like everything out there is like, is this based on a true story? And then if it is, it sort of jumps ahead of the pile. As far as comics, I look at it as like the comics industry is really just becoming, it's sort of like getting back onto the track that it was on before the comics code, before Frederick Wortham. Like if comic books had been allowed to grow and flourish in a natural way in the United States and had not been mocked and literally burned, this is the kind of industry that we would have. Like, we would have had books as smart and elegant and nuanced as Bix decades ago. But those books are showing up now, and we're just going to see more and more. And it's a great thing for the industry, and I think it's a great thing for the readers who, whether they were like the manga kids of the 2000s or the superhero kids of the 90s, who are now growing up, and there's more than just the Avengers and Justice League. There's this incredible array of great comics of all different stripes that can appeal to anyone, whatever life stage you're in, whatever you've gone through, whatever your interests are.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Van. I mean, for decades, comics meant superheroes, and then there was underground comics that eventually, came up to be that kind of autobiographical scene that included like Chester Brown and Seth and, Robert Crumb and all those kinds of people. And those were two real extremes. But it's only in the past 2 decades or so that we've started to fill in the massive middle ground between those two extremes. And I don't think we're anywhere near done yet. I mean, there is so much, you can do in comics that has never been done before. I mean, that, like I said before, that was one of the things that made me want to do Bix. Like, I wanted to do something that hadn't been done, at least not quite the way I was going to do it. And you can still do that in comics. And as long as that's true, like I say, I don't think we're anywhere near done with this present explosion of creativity in comics in all genres.
Well, that's very reassuring to hear. Back to the history of comics, I'm interested in your influences. I did have some ideas about the artwork and some influences I've noticed in but I want to hear from you. So for Two Dead, there seems to be a reflection of Will Eisner in these comics. Paul Pope has a similar style of layout and artistic use of words. Brent Anderson's unusual superhero history comic, The Astro City, featured a storyline called The Dark Age, and there was changes in superhero storytelling through the eyes of 2 African-American brothers, similar to your characters in Two Dead. One is a lawman and the other is involved with crime. Any influence on your work, or
stylistically, I'm 42 years old, so I was able to catch on in the mid-late 90s with Paul Pope's kind of rise, and with what I was seeking to do all of a sudden, as a 20-year-old, he was a very big example to me of someone a few years older who was doing their own thing, who was self-publishing at the time, with just such rich black and so much texture and such a vibrant organic incorporation of sound effects and lettering. A lot of his THB stuff and 100%. These were the books that showed me that, wait a minute, the things that I'm trying to do have some kind of precedent. There is space for it. Astro City, I've actually never read. A lot of mid-90s to mid-2000s, more highly visible indie comics completely fell by the wayside. That was my punkist era, where my entire life was dedicated to my band, touring, recording, and being involved with the punk community. So I missed like the entire Astro City, Transmetropolitan Authority era of comics. Stylistically, Eisner is a huge influence. Bill Sienkiewicz. At my core, I'm also still like mostly influenced by 70s, 80s superhero artists. Even the more far out stuff I do, there's still a part of me that is always trying to be Arthur Adams or Michael Golden. But in terms of indie cartoonists, like the influence, I'm just gazing over at my bookshelf, the influence of Gillian Tamaki, Dash Shaw, Kevin Huizenga, Dylan Horrocks, Emily Carroll, Becky Cloonan, and Charles Burns' Black Hole. That's sort of what I would put in a blender that sort of gives me guidance with what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, for the storytelling side of things, I think with Two Dead, I mean, every project has its own influences, and I try to. This is such a vague, like artsy thing to say, and I don't think that I'm a like dreamy artsy kind of writer, but I try to focus on just a like a mood or a vibe for a project, and then it's look for like spiritual cousins to line up with. So a lot of that, I mean, LA Confidential was one that was a pretty clean analog to it, but a lot of it, noir very rarely gets into the repercussions of violence. I would say maybe the Parker books a little bit, and the Darwin Cook Parker adaptations are phenomenal if anyone's looking for good noir. But mostly war fiction. So there are just tons of great war books about the horrors of war. And so, whether it's, I'm trying to think of, like, obviously Hemingway has a couple of great books, Slaughterhouse-Five, and then and this is kind of a strange thing, but getting into the mindset of what it's like to have gone through World War II. I'm a huge fan of Willie and Joe. Those to me that's like the greatest cartoons that have ever existed, and I have the giant collection that Fantagraphics put together from a few years ago, and so I went back to those a lot when I was working on the book.
Okay, that was my first suggestion, and I just flew right over it. So I'm glad I got that point right.
Yeah, you nailed it. No, it was exactly it. And I found out later, my grandpa, who died when I was 1, so I never knew him, but he served in World War II. And after I was a fan of Willie and Joe, I was asking my dad about that comic strip, and he was like, "Oh yeah, like." Dad, so my grandpa had, like, he came back from World War II with this giant collection of, like, he had stashed away Willie and Joe cartoons because he loved it so much.
Scott, did you want to talk about your influences? You do mention Ray Fox as his graphic novel One Soul as being one that inspired Bix.
Yeah, that was one. I mean, I have kind of general influences. We were talking about Will Eisner before, is a big one for me, just in terms of his, kind of a very specific, control over storytelling, using the page. Jeff Smith is a big influence in terms of his sense of timing. He has that animator's sense of timing, which is so precise and will charm your pants off. Yves Chaland, the European cartoonist who just has a great sense of design. I mean, those are kind of my big three. But for Bix specifically, One Soul was a book that Oni Press put out by Ray Fox. I don't know, it might be 10 years ago now, maybe not, maybe 7-8 years, which is not as well known as I think it should be. But it is really interesting in that the pages are divided into, I don't know, maybe 8 or 12 or even 16, I can't even remember, kind of equal size panels, and then you open the book up and it's the same on the other side, and each spread, each different panel, I wish I'd thought to pull a book off the shelf, but each different panel follows a different character in a different time period. And the way you can read it, I mean, you can read it any number of ways. You can read it kind of one character story going through each spread. You can read just the person in the top left. You could read just the person in the bottom right. There's no correct way to read the thing. My assistant just brought me this, my charming, lovely assistant. It's 9 panels per page. So it's like 18 characters you're following through this thing, and they each have their own panel on each spread that represents them. And then, you get about a third of the way through, and one of the panels goes dark when one of them dies. And then, you know, as you keep going through, obviously more and more of them die until you just get to, you know, pages full of mostly dark panels. And then, you know, I won't spoil it, but things get even more, you know, creative at the very end. And I was talking to Ray. I was sitting next to him at a show at some point after this came out, and we were talking about how it was something that could only be done with comics. You couldn't replicate this, at least the way it's told, in any other form. And it really, you know, shows you how elastic comics can be and how expressive they can be and creative they can be. And it just, you know, in one of those kind of fits of professional jealousy, I was like, well, I want to do something that could only be done in comics.
Yeah.
And that resulted in Bix. So it is a very direct influence.
Well done. Diana, I want to go back to you. I know we're kind of running low on time, but are there specific projects that you want to talk about that you've worked on over the past decade with First, Second, or Seven Seas? Anything that has really stood out that you thought was like what Scott's talking about, like this could only be done in comics, and these are the, you know, the people doing it?
You know, and that's an interesting question, specifically because I think since comics is a visual medium, and now we're at the level of technology where, you know, certain books would have been called unfilmable. Like Watchmen, for the longest time, was like, oh, that's unfilmable. You can never adapt that. And then they adapted it like twice, you know, like 3 times technically. So that being said, I think the larger, you know, question, you know, what can something that only comics can do that no other medium can do? It's, you know, it's being that space where the art medium and the movement medium and prose can all combine, but do it in a way that makes people think about oh, this is kind of like film, but it's not. This is kind of like a novel, but it's not. You know, it's like an animated thing, but it's not. And so living in that liminal space is where I think comics, you know, flourishes the most. So.
And is your new work at Serial Box as a story producer? Are you going to be working with, you know, animation and text and print, or how are you going to multimedia projects, or did you want to talk about that at all?
So Serial Box is a company that specializes in episodic, you know, digital storytelling. So it actually is just prose and audio, comes out simultaneously. And the way that the long form storytelling is structured is through writers' rooms, which is, again, a weird blend of, it's like traditional publishing, but it's not, because it also takes stuff from TV and film. I'm just really intrigued in general about how different forms of storytelling really speaks to each other. And, you know, I always have a special place in comics. I would love to work at, you know, in comics in some way, shape, or form again. And I think I would not be surprised if, you know, not just for Serial Box, but in media companies in general, are looking for ways to transverse into, all right, now we have to have a comics thing too. Now we have to figure out how to incorporate, you know, this medium, because it's so flexible. The audience is just growing more and more. As everyone has said on this panel, we're now at the point in North America where comics is treated in the same way that it's been treated in Asia or Europe for decades. And the fact that it's just a format and it's not pigeonholed to any one demographic or specific audience.
Yeah, that reminds me of this new project by Tenacious D. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but Fantagraphics is putting out Post-Apocalypto, you know, where it was originally a serial, and then it was a cartoon, and then it was an album, and now it's a graphic novel. And it's actually all of those things, and you can listen to the album, and you can watch the cartoon, and you can read the book at the same time, and of course then you can listen to the comedy act if you want. It's like a ribald rock soap opera, or not soap opera, but a sci-fi opera, if you will, kind of a project. Very interesting. I think we're about out of time. I had one question that was kind of a fun question in thinking about character and the stories that we're bringing forth, and it's basically for you, Scott. What do you put yourself in Bix's shoes for a minute, and if he were alive today, how do you think he would react to his life in comic form?
I've kind of thought about that. I used to get the question a lot after Two Generals came out. Well, people used to say all the time, "Oh, your grandfather would be so proud of this," and I don't think that's true. I think for the first of all, he was a very private man and probably would not have enjoyed the, close look at what was a very personal experience for him. But also in his generation, comics, to him would have been like Mutt and Jeff, and I think he would have thought like I was making fun of him and his experience by doing it in this form. So, like, just generationally, I think like Bix Beiderbecke, would have been a little older still, so there might have been that disconnect. But in terms of doing something that is personal and risk-taking and experimental, I think he would have gotten that part of it and approved of that part of it. I don't know. We'd have to talk about it, me and Bix. It might require a little bit of explaining, but I do think he would get it and approve. It wouldn't be over a drink though, because that guy would get scary. I would try to stop him. I would try to be like, "Hey, let's put the brakes on. Just drink some water."
Yeah. He would start seeing those monsters under the bed, and yeah, pretty scary stuff. All right. Well, Van and Nate, did you have anything to add as a final comment on anything about you want the audience to know about Two Dead or your next projects coming out, or anything you'd like to say about your cartooning style, or what's up next for you guys?
I think up next for me is just trying to manage quarantine life as a parent. Like that is the like way beyond the horizon. That is all that I see. So like if I ever do anything creative ever again, we'll see.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on the COVID situation. That's a whole nother conversation.
It'll still be here for the next 50 Comic-Cons.
Yeah, we can talk about it at 2021.
Yeah.
Via Zoom.
We'll see how much it's impacted storytelling and how many stories come out of this. Well, thank you so much for your time, and it's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Annalisa, for being a great moderator.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Diana.
You're here.